Chapter 4, Listening. In this chapter, we're going to talk about some effective styles of listening, and we're going to contrast them to some ineffective styles of listening, and a little bit about adjusting listening to different situations. We listen for different purposes in different situations, and we'll also touch on the fact that there can be cultural differences involved in listening as well. The process of listening actually has 5 steps, and of course these 5 steps take place very quickly. What do the 5 steps remind you of as far as another concept that we studied in the last short amount of time? Think about that. There are 5 steps in listening, and they take place very quickly. Here's an illustration of the 5 steps. The first one that takes place is receiving the stimuli. And it's not just the words said. Remember, communication is a package of signals, so there's more to receiving than just hearing the words. There are the nonverbals, there's even the timing of the message. From receiving the stimulation, receiving the message, we then attempt to understand it. And involved in understanding is remembering what we can associate what we're receiving with. And then, hopefully, after we are sure we fully understand the message, then we can evaluate and respond. Responding comes near the end of the process. So the first step is receiving. We receive the message, and it's more than just hearing. It's the gestures, the expressions, how quickly it's said, the volume. So there's a lot that goes with that message that we need to notice. We'll talk more about this as we talk about effective ways of listening. That little boy there, it looks like his dad's trying to get him to eat his vegetables. If the dad says, "Eat your broccoli, son," that means one thing to the boy. If the father slams the table and says, "Eat your broccoli, son," that means something different to that boy. Here are some tips on improving reception. Focus on what is said and not said. Notice those nonverbals. Don't assume that you already understand. Don't let that one type of noise we talked about quite a bit in Chapter 1 interfere with you really understanding the message. Do you remember what type of noise that was that would cause you to jump into, thinking, I know what he's going to say, or I've already decided how I'm going to respond? What type of noise is that? The third one, of course, avoid distractions in the environment. Physical noise, right? And or could be other types of noise too, or just distractions, rather visual distractions. And the last one, avoid wanting to interrupt. Let's talk about noise for a moment here. So noise is anything that interferes with a person receiving a message as the source intended the message to be received. And think about the 4 types of noise from Chapter 1 and how they would interfere with you fully understanding a message. Semantic has to do with words, right? So if you don't understand some of the words, that would stand in the way of fully understanding the message you're receiving. Physical noise, of course, that's the first noise we think of. If there's a loud machinery nearby and you can't hear what's being sent to you, what's being said, that would definitely be a noise. Physiological noise, impairments of the senses. And finally, that one we talked about being present so often, psychological noise. So each one of those could have an effect on effective listening. The second step is understanding. Here again, you want to avoid judging before fully understanding. We generally relate what we're hearing, the message that we're getting when we're listening, related to things that we already know. Sometimes we ask questions to clarify and rephrasing to check understanding if necessary. These last two, asking questions to clarify and rephrasing, we'll talk about those a little more when we talk about active listening. Remembering, in the process of understanding a message, we will sometimes, we generally do, associate it with things that we know already. And one way to do this is to think of the central ideas being given to us and how they connect with what we already know. We will summarize the message in our head to ourselves. We will repeat names and key concepts to ourselves. Central ideas, central names, key concepts will stand out in our head to us. We'll associate these things to what we already understand and know. And a funny thing happens. We won't talk a lot about this, but our memory does tend to record what we think we heard. The fourth step is evaluating. And hopefully, first we want to be sure that we understood the message and we've identified any biases before we really make an evaluation of the message. Responding comes near the end of receiving the message, but actually there are two types of responses that we can give. And one is the response that we give while the speaker is talking. These are the types of responses I'm sure you would recognize. Someone nods their head, you're listening, or your listener is listening to you, and they're nodding. They're saying, "Okay, oh, I see. Really, that's interesting." And these are the responses that are given while the message is still being sent. That's one type of response, and that is called back channeling. The other type of response is given, of course, after the speaker is finished, after the message has been finished. Now, here's some tips for responding most effectively. It's been shown that back channeling proves to be supportive and encouraging to the speaker. By giving them some response and some acknowledgement while they're still speaking, it really encourages them to give you more. And this may even be something like a puzzled expression on your face that might encourage them to explain a little more detail, that kind of thing. It's also good to remember that iMessages are good because you're taking responsibility, you're taking ownership of your response. So, in other words, instead of saying to someone, you've heard their message, they've explained the situation, instead of saying, no one's going to believe that, you might say, I don't believe that. Or something like, no one's going to agree with that. I don't agree with that. Or instead of saying, you aren't making that clear, you might want to say, I don't understand that. That is not clear to me. Just a way to show that you're acknowledging that as the receiver, you're the one responsible for understanding that message. Listening is more than hearing words. It's truly understanding and accepting the other person's message and also their situation and feelings. Listening is situational. The type of listening you might do with a friend who's explaining a problem to you would be different than the style of listening that you use in a class lecture. So you want to determine what style to use depending on the situation. We're going to talk about these 4 styles of effective listening, and they would be used at different times in different situations. Several of them might be used in one situation, definitely. Let's look at the first one, empathic listening. Empathic listening is really putting yourself in someone's place to try to feel how they're feeling, to really helps you understand others, where they're coming from. And there's 2 parts to empathic listening: to see the world through their eyes, to feel what they feel. Thinking empathy, an understanding of what makes them think the way they're thinking. Feeling empathy, attempting to feel as they do. We're going to mention manners and polite listening. The book talks quite a bit about being polite. And it is something to think about, because surely we're probably going to get further ahead by exhibiting some type of politeness to another person than being impolite. So really, as far as effective listening, polite listening includes avoiding interrupting, trying to show empathy, trying to put yourself in the other's place. In our culture, it includes eye contact and some type of encouraging feedback. Now, positive feedback doesn't necessarily mean you agree with everything they say. We're going to get to that in a moment. There's definitely a place for critical listening. We'll get to that in a moment. We also want to distinguish surface listening from depth listening. Surface listening is hearing the words only. Depth listening is more than that. Depth listening is noticing those nonverbals. See, we finally put a name to what we were talking about earlier in this presentation. When you take in more than just the word said, and you consider how it's said, the expressions that go with it, even the timing of the message, it's called depth listening. Now, which one of these do you think is going to help you get more out of your understanding and be a more effective listener? If you said depth listening, you're right. So depth listening can really get you to the underlying message, if there is an underlying message. And surface listening cannot do that. Sometimes what's not said says a lot. If someone isn't offering a lot to you, that can send you a message too. Non-judgmental listening, this is definitely what you want to do while you're still trying to understand what someone is saying. You want to try to keep an open mind, recognize those biases, and this empathy plays a big part in this. Understanding is primary in being an effective listener. So empathy is important when you're trying to understand, but there is more. After putting yourself in the speaker's place, and once you're sure you understand, then it's necessary to take yourself out of the situation, because there are definitely situations where once you understand the message, you're not always going to evaluate that message in a positive way. So it's important to become objective and not be influenced by personal feelings or opinions once you do understand and you have put yourself in the person's place. Critical listening is definitely part of effective listening. Critical listening is analyzing, evaluating. Maybe you agree with some of it, maybe you don't agree with some of it, maybe you don't agree with any of it. And there are times when we need to be critical. Only when you fully understand should you then evaluate the message. Now let's talk about active listening. Active listening expresses understanding of the speaker's feelings, generally asks a question or asks questions as the conversation is moving forward. And active listening involves that paraphrasing and restating to check understanding. You might reword a message as you heard it, but in your own words to just check for that understanding. We'll do some active listening practice in class. Here are the tips for active listening. Paraphrasing the speaker's message in your feedback, and not every message is going to call for this, but if it's a more involved message, if you feel that it's needed, definitely do it. You want to express your understanding, express your empathy. Doesn't have to get all detailed and just some expression of understanding or empathy. Encourage the speaker to elaborate by asking a question. You definitely want to acknowledge the feelings sent in the message by the person, and your feedback will restate the message as you understood it. So active listening, by practicing it, you will become a more effective listener. We do need to acknowledge that listening can be affected by cultural differences. Language and speech, what's expected, the words used, all those nonverbal behaviors. The easiest one to recognize, to talk about, is eye contact, or how the position of the body when someone speaks to you. There are a lot of nonverbals that vary between cultures, of course. Feedback and credibility. Feedback, the type of feedback you give. Is it short? Is it more involved? Do you say yes sir, no sir? Little things like that. They vary between cultures, of course. And credibility, as far as the kind of credibility put on different types of speakers, that can vary between cultures. So your enculturation can definitely affect listening and what's considered effective listening, polite listening. It's interesting to note, and this is a generalization, but more than one research study has shown that women, by and large, women communicate, or they communicate, but they do listen to build relationships, to be involved with people. Women tend to use more eye contact than men, and women, incidentally, tend to use more back channeling cues. Those are generalizations, but they have been shown to be truer than not. On the other hand, some good research also shows that men tend to use fewer listening cues or back channeling, and men communicate facts with an emphasis on facts and less relationship oriented, less concerned with people than stating the facts and establishing expertise, creating figuring out where they are in the hierarchy, that kind of thing. Now, neither of this isn't a bad thing. It's just the way we're enculturated. A few more tips on listening with power and effectiveness. And we think of power as being a hierarchical thing. We think of power as being we think of the word control. Well, actually, control works here because really controlling the situation, controlling your understanding, having a grasp of that is going to make you more effective. By using back channeling cues, you'll encourage the speaker to continue in moderation, of course. And avoiding adapters. Adapters are little habits that we have. We have a personal need to, for instance, play with our hair while we're listening or tapping our foot. And these adapters don't always send a message that's positive. They can sometimes send messages that other people might perceive as being insecure or being preoccupied. So adapters aren't looked on as a good thing when you're listening. You want to try to keep those to a minimum.